presumed drowned. In 1914, the Newfoundland sailed up to the ice with a crew of 250 men. On March 30th, 77 men went out on the ice to kill seals. A mighty storm came up while the men were out that lasted 2 days, and the men could not make it back to the ship. When the storm ceased, other ships came and helped the crew of the Newfoundland search for the missing men. 72 were found dead, and 5 were missing and presumed drowned. The ship sailed home in sorrow and did not go to the ice at all the next year. She was considered to be unlucky. To break the curse, the ship was rebuilt and changed so that she would drown no more men. Her new name was the San Blanford, and she was sent to the ice 2 years after the terrible storm. On the 30th day of March, she met up with another ship called the Terra Nova. As dusk fell, a fog rolled in, and the crew of the San Blanford heard the Terra Nova blowing her whistle. This was a signal that she still had men out on the ice. As was customary, the crew of the San Blanford started blowing their whistle, and those above deck could hear voices calling out from the ice and presumed they belonged to sailors from the Terra Nova. The two ships kept up their signals until 10 p.m., when the voices ceased and all were presumed safely aboard ship. The next morning, a sailor from the San Blanford boarded the Terra Nova to conduct some business. The captain of the ship immediately asked the sailor what time the members of the San Blanford crew had gotten aboard the previous night. The sailor was puzzled. "We didn't have anyone out on the ice, sir," he told the captain. But the captain and his crew swore that they had seen several men board the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. When the sailor returned to the San Blanford, he reported the incident to his captain. The captain took him quietly aside and told him that the report was true. A few members of the night crew had seen 5 men climb aboard the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. The men were wearing tattered clothing that looked as if it had been ripped and worn out by the waves of the sea, and the crew could see right through their shining bodies. One of the sailors on duty that evening had been on the Newfoundland when she lost the 77 men 2 years ago that very night. He had recognized the faces of the ghosts as those belonging to the 5 men who were presumed drowned. Their spirits had finally returned to the ship from which they had been lost and could now rest in peace. Saxe Bridge. I don't know what exactly draws me back to Saxe Bridge each time I visit Gettysburg. I just know that I feel compelled to drive there and take pictures. Of course, it is a beautiful spot, a covered bridge that was used by the Confederate Army to cross the creek when they withdrew from Gettysburg. But after all, how many pictures can you take of the same place? Well, okay, if you're a photographer, that's a silly question. Hundreds in all weather, season, lighting. But really, I'm only an amateur, so why I personally felt compelled to record the bridge over and over was a mystery my boyfriend was obsessing about as he drove through the darkening countryside one evening in the late fall. Of course, the bridge was supposed to be haunted, so that was definitely part of the draw it had for me. According to the legend, 3 Confederate soldiers convicted of being spies were hanged from beams in the covered bridge, and their bodies were discovered by Union soldiers patrolling the area. Their spirits were said to haunt the bridge, though other folks claimed they sometimes smelled General Lee smoking his pipe when they were standing on the bridge. I'd actually smelled pipe smoke there once myself, and that was one of the reasons I kept coming back to the haunted bridge. As we came to the bridge, a chill blasted over my skin in spite of the warmth flowing into the car from the heater. The bridge, usually a friendly spot, seemed sinister and dark. I felt uneasy, as if a foul presence was on the bridge that did not want us to intrude there. I changed my mind, I said quickly as my boyfriend stopped the car. "I don't want to take pictures here after all." "What?" my boyfriend practically screeched, staring at me in amazement. "After you made such a big fuss about it? After you forced me to look at every single solitary picture you ever took of this bridge before we came to Gettysburg? No way, honey. I could be back at the hotel drinking beer right now, but no. We had to come to the bridge. How you get and take your photos?" He was right, I guess. Silly to come all this way and not take the pictures. But I was utterly terrified to step out onto the bridge. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, and shook again as I secured my camera. Praying with all my might that whatever dark power was out there would leave me alone, I leapt out the door and aimed my camera practically at random down the length of the bridge. It was completely empty of everything but me and the car as I took several snapshots. But I could feel a very nasty someone standing right behind me, willing me to leave or die. Their presence throbbed at me in an almost physical way, and my skin crawled desperately. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. I just whirled my camera around, aimed it over my shoulder, and snapped a picture fast. Then I leapt back into the car before whoever or whatever decided to grab me and gasped, "Get me out of here now." My boyfriend took one look at my white face filled with eye-popping terror and got me out of there now. I didn't stop shaking until we were safely back in our hotel room for the night. When I loaded up the digital pictures on my laptop computer the next morning, I went immediately to the pictures of the Sachs Bridge, unsure of what I would see. In the first photo, a little boy in period costume stood an arm's length away from the camera. He was glaring at me with a twisted little face and an evil grin. He certainly hadn't been there when I took the picture, yet he looked solid enough to be real. The second photo was filled with misty figures that looked like phantoms. Creepy. I shuddered as I looked at them and quickly went to the next photo, the one I took over my shoulder without turning around. I gave a shriek of fear which brought my boyfriend crashing into the room. "What is it?" he shouted, and I pointed a shaking finger at the screen of the laptop. Pictured on it was a filmy dark figure, half human, half beast, with blazing orange eyes filled with such menace and hatred that it made my stomach roil. He appeared so close to the camera that he must have been directly behind me. He looked like the devil. My boyfriend's eyes popped and he gasped, "Delete it. Delete it now." Yet how could I delete it? I had captured pictures of ghosts on my camera. Was it worth the fright I had? I wasn't sure about that. Still, I couldn't delete them. My boyfriend refused blankly to look at the photos more than once, and he swore never to take me to Sachs Bridge again. But I may go back there someday. Screaming Tunnel. There is a tunnel under the old railroad tracks just to the west of the Queen Elizabeth Way in Niagara Falls. It is known locally as the Screaming Tunnel. A path wanders through the tunnel and then up to an empty field on the hill. But the field was not always empty. At one time, a large farmhouse stood in the field at the top of the hill, and in it lived a happy family. Then one night, the house caught fire. A young daughter was trapped in the house, and the only way to escape was through a wall of flames. The brave young girl covered her face with her arms and ran into the fiery doorway. Her long hair and her long nightgown began to smolder as she burst through the flames and rushed out of the house. When the night air struck her smoldering clothing, it burst into flames, enveloping the girl in a raging inferno. The girl screamed in agony and ran blindly down the hill, away from the fire-stricken house. She staggered into the tunnel under the train tracks, her screams echoing and re-echoing through the night. Overcome by the flames, the girl fell to the floor of the tunnel, wailing in agony. She rolled frantically on the floor of the tunnel, trying to douse the flames, but her efforts were weak and ineffective. She was quickly overcome and burned to death in the tunnel under the tracks. Shadow Train. A miner was on his way to Dos Cabezas, where he heard there was good prospecting, when he found himself lost and alone in the flats just north of the Dragoon Mountains. In the blistering sun of midday, his burro dropped dead from heatstroke, and the prospector knew that he would shortly follow if he did not find shelter and something to drink. The landscape wobbled before his eyes, and he staggered forward, determined not to drop. But the heat of the desert flats seeped deep into his body, and he found his wits wandering. The last sensible thought that crossed his mind before he collapsed was the sorrow his mother would feel when he did not return home from his wanderings. He was awakened by a steady chug-chug sound. He raised his head from the hard and dusty ground and looked blurrily around him. It sounded like a train was approaching. But that was impossible. There were no tracks in this inhospitable location and no town for miles. Clackety-clack. Clackety-clack. The sound came again, louder this time. Chug, chug, chug. Then the hiss of steam from an engine. He was hallucinating, he decided. The miner laid his head on his arms and waited for death to come. As he broiled in the heat, he seemed to hear the words of the old-timer from whom he had learned of the good prospecting sites in the north. The grizzled man had spoken of a shadow train that had come bursting out of nowhere and ran just above the flats where no railroad tracks had ever lain. The shadow train had sped across the desert before his very eyes, a dark smudge against the dazzling light of noonday. It had vanished into the distance while the old man watched, wavering into mirage and then vanishing into the dazzle of the sun. At the time, the young miner had thought the old man was a bit of a nut. It was an illusion caused by heat stroke, he assumed. But with the steady chug-chug-chug growing louder in his ears, he was not so sure. He raised his head again and saw a black speck, dark as the deepest shadow, approaching rapidly. He heard the sharp whistle of a train once, twice. The speck grew larger, and he could make out the shape of a black steam engine pulling two cars. A yellow headlight gleamed oddly in the white-hot glare of the sun. The whistle sounded sharply again as the train hurtled toward him. The young miner wanted to leap out of its path, but his body was too far gone. He could not even lift himself. He closed his eyes and braced for the impact, but the train slowed suddenly and stopped just a few feet from his head. A jolly-faced conductor stepped out of the train and came over to him. The conductor bent down and lifted him from the ground. Someone else whom he couldn't see caught his feet, and he was carried inside a passenger car. He felt himself laid down in the aisle, and kind faces surrounded him. "Water," he gasped faintly, just before losing consciousness. He was wakened by the feeling of cold water smoothed onto his face. He opened his eyes and saw a tall man wearing a sheriff's badge carefully trickling water from a pitcher over him. The man put down the pitcher and held a cup to his lips, careful not to give him too much water at once. The miner had to swish the water around his swollen tongue several times before he could swallow. When he was finally able to speak, he asked the sheriff what had happened. "Fellow found you nearly dead about 5 miles out of town," the sheriff answered laconically. "What town?" asked the young prospector cautiously, visions of shadow trains and jolly conductors in his head. The sheriff looked at him strangely. "That sun sure must have messed with your head, son, if you can't even remember where you was headed," said the sheriff. "You're in Wilcox, Arizona." "It's a stop on the train, then?" he asked hesitantly. "Train?" "There ain't no train around for miles," said the sheriff. "You better have some more water and rest a bit. That sun's nearly sent you loco." The young miner lay back down thankfully and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure why the shadow train had come to his rescue, but he was sure glad it had stopped for him. Years later, the Southern Pacific Railroad put a track right through Wilcox, Arizona, and real trains started rolling through Arizona. But some say the shadow train still races through the flats at midday, where no track was ever laid. Spite and Divel. Once in old New Amsterdam, there was a brave trumpeter named Anthony Van Corlear who would blow his trumpet when Peter Stuyvesant wanted to call the people together. One night, Peter received word that the English were going to attack New Amsterdam. He sent Anthony to warn the Dutch colonists along the Hudson and to call the people to fight. A storm was brewing. When Anthony reached the tip of Manhattan Island, there was no ferry to take him across the Tidewater Creek, which connects the Harlem and Hudson rivers at the tip of Manhattan Island. Anthony called out for the ferryman, but there was no answer. Conscious of his important mission, Anthony decided he would swim across that creek in spite of the devil, in spite den Divel. Well, the devil heard Anthony calling for the ferryman, and when Anthony was well into the middle of the creek, the devil caught him by the leg. Anthony pulled out his trumpet and blew a terrific blast, louder than the wind. It startled the devil so much that he let go of Anthony's leg. But Anthony did not have strength enough after his fight with the devil to swim the creek, and so he drowned. For many years after this, folks living at the northern tip of Manhattan claimed they could hear Anthony's trumpet blowing louder than the wind on nights when it stormed. And the creek where Anthony met his fate was called Spuyten Duyvil. Suicide. I heard the neighbor's car running in the garage as I got into my car to drive to the grocery store. That seemed a bit odd, since it was summertime. Why would they need to warm it up? I shrugged the thought away and drove to the store. An hour later, I heard the car again as I unpacked the groceries from the trunk. I frowned. Maybe they'd just gotten back. I couldn't see anything because the garage door was closed. As I was putting the groceries away, my mother phoned about some arrangements for my son's 3rd birthday party. We talked for nearly an hour. Then I ran back out to the car to get a bag I'd forgotten, and heard my neighbor's car again. Maybe they forgot it was still running? I walked over to their house and rang the doorbell repeatedly. No answer. Now I was getting worried. There was no sign of anyone home, and normally the kids would be out playing in the backyard with their father at this time of day. I phoned the house. No answer. I phoned both parents' cell phones. I got voicemail. I couldn't leave things there. A car running in a closed garage was dangerous. Reluctantly, I called the police and explained the situation. They sent someone over and found the father dead in the car. Suicide. Worse, the carbon monoxide had crept into the house and all the children were affected. The eldest girl and the baby were far enough away from the garage to recover quickly, but the middle daughter was hospitalized in a coma. I went every day with her hysterical mother to visit. Poor woman. A dead husband, traumatized children, and a daughter who would be a vegetable all her life, even if she woke from her coma. My family did everything we could to ease her burden as she waited for her family who lived overseas to arrive. I took her to the hospital to see her child, and my mother watched the other kids while we were out. My husband even went over to cut the grass and fix the leak in her sink. On the 4th visit to the hospital, something strange happened. While I was watching by the side of the little girl and my neighbor was talking with the nurse in the hall, a breeze swept suddenly into the room and seemed to whirl about the little girl. It flattened the hair on her head as if it were a hand patting it. I heard the murmur of a man's voice. Then the breeze vanished, and in that instant the child's eyes popped open and she sat up in bed. I exclaimed in surprise, bringing my neighbor running with the nurse. And the child called out to her mother in a perfectly rational voice. "Mama," she said, holding out her little arms. Her mother swept her up into a huge hug. The child hugged her back and said, "Daddy was here. He said he was sorry I had gotten hurt, and then he missed me. He told me to wake up, so I did. He said he missed you too." I know, I gasped. So did the nurse. My neighbor was crying tears of joy for her daughter and pain for her loss. Quietly, we tiptoed out of the room and left them alone. But I wondered, looking back over my shoulder, about that strange breeze that had swept through the room. Was it possible I had seen my neighbor's spirit talking to his daughter? I shivered a bit and went to phone my husband with the good news. Swept over. Today, the water drums of the lower falls in Yellowstone National Park beat strongly, just as they did back in 1870 when the story which became a legend first took place. In those days, a group of 5 militiamen and their Crow guide who decided to explore the little-known canyon of the Yellowstone. The explorers penetrate deep into the canyon region, keeping an eye out for signs of gold while they explored. On the morning of April 2nd, the expedition paused in the foothills to sink a hole into a likely spot, having seen promising signs of ore. When their Crow guide told them there was a small band of Native Americans he identified as sheep eaters were camped for miles upstream, they were not unduly distressed. They had plenty of advanced weaponry among them, enough to take on a small native band if it decided to attack. That night, the Native American tribesmen ran off with the explorers' pack horses. When the theft was discovered at daylight, the white men pursued the thieves into the precipitous mountains. The tribesmen had a 4-hour head start on the explorers, but the white men were fewer in number and gained rapidly on their quarry. After 3 hours of hard riding, the explorers came suddenly upon the tribe. They were crossing the river just above the lower falls aboard a hastily constructed raft of driftwood held together with thongs made of buckskin and buffalo robes. A circle of men sat with their weapons at the center of the unwieldy raft while the women paddled desperately for the opposite shore with wide pieces of bark. The stolen pack horses were swimming beside the raft, which was swept precariously downstream in spite of the rowers' best efforts. The watching explorers realized that the river current was too strong for the unwieldy craft. The paddlers were fighting a losing battle to reach the opposite bank. The horses had a better chance of success. 4 of them were already climbing the bank on the far shore. Beside the explorers, the Crow guide calmly raised his rifle and fired at the retreating band. One of the braves gave a yell of pain, and an explorer cried, "For God's sake, boys, don't murder them, they are bound to go over the falls." At that moment, the raft was caught in an eddy and sank an inch or two below the surface so that the men and women aboard her appeared to be sitting on top of the river like water spirits or the ancient gods. It was an eerie sight. The spell was broken when a brave fired an arrow through the arm of the Crow guide. With an angry yelp, the Crow guide fired again into their midst, wounding a second warrior. The explorers had to tie up their guide to prevent him from shooting more members of the doomed band. The raft moved swiftly toward the edge, carrying the wailing women and the unmoving braves, who began chanting a soft death song. The warriors gazed calmly toward the lip of the falls, where the water disappeared so abruptly with a roar like thunder. Their courage in the face of sure death silenced the watching explorers. One by one, the white men raised their hats in salute to the brave warriors below as the raft, still intact, sailed out over the lip of the falls and disappeared into the roaring white foam with its human cargo. In that heart-wrenching moment, 2 large eagles flew over the roaring mouth of the precipice, screaming their defiance as the water thundered like drums on the jagged rocks far below. It was a fitting tribute to the bravery of the dead tribesmen below. With many backward glances, the white explorers turned their horses away from the river and rode away. To this day, people who stand on the platform at the brink of the lower falls of Yellowstone sometimes hear the voices of the chanting warriors singing their death song. And the river water sometimes flows with a red tinge like that of blood.